talk about foundations of cooperative AI. But before that, I wanted to say a few quick words about the impact that Joe has had on me. But I got lazy, and so I decided to ask Bing Chat instead. Somehow nobody at this whole event so far yet that I noticed has mentioned ChatGPT, so I wanted to fix that. So I asked Bing Chat, please describe the relationship between Joe Halpern and Vince Conitzer over the years. And Bing Chat should have access to the internet and everything as well. And so there you go. Starts out pretty well on topics. But we have collaborated on several papers, including Joe's book on reasoning about uncertainty, and then 2 other papers that sound very interesting. And then it concludes that we've had a close and productive research relationship over the years. It sounds wonderful, but it's fantasy. So in fact, Joe's book is real, but I had no impact on it that I know of. The other 2 papers, I think, don't actually exist. And in any case, so I'm not one of Joe's students. Maybe I should have been, but I wasn't one of Joe's students. And in fact, we've never even co-authored anything together. And so here, in fact, I think I'm one of the grains of sand on the beach, representing the many other grains of sand of people that weren't in Eva's list this morning, and that haven't even co-authored with Joe, but that have been impacted by him in so many other ways, right? Sometimes directly, but getting advice from Joe at a conference, letters being written, all those kinds of things, but also through the institutions that he helped set up, such as the TARC conference, which I'll mention a couple of times here as well. And all the students that he had and all the collaborators that he had, like Adam is now a colleague of mine, right? So we end up being influenced in so many ways. And finally, of course, the actual research. And so that's another thing I want to focus on today. That's Joe's work actually, besides all these great results, some of which date back to last century, it continues to be extremely relevant to entirely new research directions, right? And I'm sometimes wondering, did Joe see it all coming? Or was it more just that, he thinks at a high level about the right abstraction, the right way to think about the questions, and then automatically at some point it will turn up. I think it's maybe more the latter. In any case, today I'll talk to you about our new research lab at CMU on foundations of cooperative AI, and in particular how that relates to some of Joe's work as well. And I also want to show you that even at the foundations, there are still a lot of questions left unanswered. And hopefully we'll have this be a little bit fun and interactive as well. I don't need to get through all my slides. If there are any economists in the room, you're welcome to do your usual thing of, let me get a few slides in at least. But yeah, okay. So what is this about? Oops.
Buy now. You don't have a choice. Buy now.
I'm not going to buy now. Okay, there we go. So what we're thinking about is that as AI systems or algorithms more broadly control more and more of our world, inevitably they're also going to start running up against each other more often. And when they do, sometimes these interactions can be unexpected, and sometimes they can also be very damaging. Right, so this is what I'll refer to as tragedies of algorithmic interaction. And in particular, another thing that we're thinking about is that, well, in the future, maybe more of those interactions will be more game theoretic in nature as these systems pursue their own objectives. And so we'll see examples of that shortly. Here on the right-hand side, we have a little story. So I imagine, I ask you to imagine these 2 self-driving cars, orange one and a green one. And the orange one pulls up behind the green one, starts tailgating, and it says, well, if I tailgate you, is your occupant going to take over control and pull over? Now, you have to understand, if you're a self-driving car, that's a total loss of face, right? So the green car gets very nervous. What makes you think I would tell you? And the orange car says, you just told me, right? You're nervous. You better get out of the way. And then the green car says, you're bluffing. Maybe you're willing to take the chance. Okay, so this story is supposed to be a little bit funny. I don't know if it's very funny, but if it's funny, the reason that it's funny is that we don't actually expect self-driving cars to behave this way, right? And yet I will argue that we've been taught to think that way in the AI literature. So I'll come back to that. Here's a bit of an outline. I'm going to talk, first of all, about these tragedies of algorithmic interaction. Some examples, some more tragic than others. Here's a funny one.
Point out it's just as funny if only one of the cars is robotic.
What's that? It's
just as funny if only one of the 2 is robotic.
Even if only one of the 2 is robotic. Okay, now I'm thinking about the 2 different cases. Yeah, okay. Good. Okay, so here was something that happened on Amazon at some point. There was this book, The Making of a Fly, which I'm sure is a wonderful book, but for some reason it was selling for around $2 million. And it doesn't seem to be any reason that it should be selling for about $2 million, especially with the used copy going for only $35. And so I think it was a Berkeley postdoc who at some point discovered this and is like, what's going on? Why is this book selling for such a crazy amount? And he figured it out eventually. So what was going on was that, and in the end, the price went up much further to $24 million. And the reason was that the two sellers were using algorithmic pricing. And one of them, each of them was looking at the other's price. One of them was trying to undercut the other one. And so it was always setting its price to be 0.998 times the other one's price. But for some reason, the other one was actually multiplying the price of the other by a ratio greater than 1. I don't know why. Maybe they wanted to appear to be the higher quality seller, or maybe the strategy was just to go buy the book from the other one if they got a sale, and then they take the markup. In any case, because this is so much higher than 1, right? You can see if this is iteratively applied, you're going to get this exponential increase in price, and that's how we got to the $24 million, where it eventually got shut down. Okay. This one is not particularly tragic. Maybe somebody really wanted to buy a new copy of the book and couldn't because it was priced ridiculously. Let's look at a little bit more serious example. There's a flash crash from 2010 where this is the Dow Jones took a $1 trillion stock market crash. That happened very rapidly. I think even today, nobody knows exactly what happened. But one thing that is clear is that high frequency traders, HFTs, so people who use algorithmic trading, had a big role in this. And something triggered these algorithms into what they called the hot potato effect, where they would buy something and then immediately want to sell it again, right? Back and forth. So some things just, the prices just completely plummeted. Here too, and there was a halt was put to this. Eventually the market recovered, so not all that much damage done. But I think we should be somewhat worried, right? Because what if this happens with AI systems that control our electrical grid? What if it happens in a cybersecurity context or a cyber warfare context, or maybe even a kinetic warfare context, or with more general purpose AI systems? So, a little bit of a downer, but that's the kind of worries that motivate us here to some extent. And again, the idea is that maybe those interactions become at some level more game theoretic, and that's what we should be thinking about. Okay, I want to come back to this idea of rethinking the design of intelligent agents. So as AI researchers, this is often the type of picture that we've been introduced to think of AI systems as agents. And I'll argue it actually is very close to the economic theory model of an agent as well. We have some agent that perceives its environment through sensors, has some model of how the world evolves, including in response to its own actions, and has some notion of utility, what it values in the world. And that is what allows it to then make decisions about what actions to take. There's always this question of where utility even comes from. And at least in older editions of this book, there's a suggestion that, well, somebody is going to tell us what the objective function is, right? We as computer scientists, we think about, well, the algorithms, and we want our algorithms to work as broadly as possible. And then somebody else that actually has a real application can go and plug in whatever objective function they want. And I think that second part of this picture, this idea of somebody coming up with the outside objective, that's coming under a lot of pressure now. And a lot of us are thinking about, well, this is maybe not the way to go. Maybe we need to think a little bit more consciously about what the objectives of these systems should be. And that's really where we get more into AI ethics. And so or sometimes it's called AI alignment, right? This idea that we actually want the objective or preferences of the system to line up with what we want for it. And so there are lots of books and conferences and other entities that are involved in this. For the purpose of today's talk, also wanting to stay a little bit closer to Joe's work, I'm actually going to focus more on the game theoretic parts and this notion of interacting systems. And so here's an example where we have, this is just a made up example, but just to illustrate it, we have two agents that each provide some part of a service. Okay? So together they provide the service for us, and each of them has to choose at which quality to deliver its part of the service. Okay? It's Q sub I for agent I. And the overall quality of the service is going to be only as good as the weaker part of the service. Okay. And now we've aligned the individual agents to the extent that we've trained them to the point that they care primarily about this overall quality, which is what we as humans care about. Except somehow we left a slight incentive to be the lower one. Maybe they've learned that if they're the lower one with the lower quality, they get a little bit of extra attention because we're trying to get the system to work better overall. So this is the game. Okay. This is what it looks like as a game. I hope most people have seen a normal form game before, right? But so here, a row is picked by one of the players. That's the quality for the row player. And the other player will call the column player and picks a number there as well. And then the numbers, that defines some entry in the matrix. And then the numbers tell you how happy each of those two agents is, okay? And our utility as human beings isn't even in here. So the key things here are the following. First of all, there's some really good outcomes here in the top left, right, where they both provide a high quality. And so there are high numbers here. Another thing to take away is that the numbers are always pretty close. At worst, they're 22 apart. I can make that go down if I make the game bigger as well. But so here, so all the numbers, so within each entry, they're always close together, the numbers, and there are good outcomes over here. And yet, the only equilibrium of this game is all the way down here. And this is the only Nash or whatever equilibrium of this game. Okay. And that also means that learning processes, to the extent that they'll pursue their own utilities, are going to end up there. So in spite of having aligned these agents quite well, overall, due to the strategic interaction, the outcome is bad. This game has a name. It's the Traveler's Dilemma with a different story that I won't tell you here. Okay. Now, for most of the rest of this talk, I'll focus just on the prisoner's dilemma, which I hope you've seen before. We have to choose whether to cooperate or defect. Everybody is best off. Well, it's better if we both cooperate, but individually we have an incentive to defect, holding fixed what the other player does. Okay, and so we would like to get to this cooperate outcome. Now, humans seem to often get to the cooperate outcome, right? And so often in this context, people think about, well, can we get AI systems to work the way that humans do? And often, they'll cite these kind of articles that talk a lot about how wonderful humans are at cooperating. That said, if you enter the search a little bit differently, you get very different results as well, right? So this is just maybe, so it's kind of interesting that these cooperation failures often tend to be more kind of big global issues as opposed to the smaller group things that maybe we are more naturally good at. So should we do it the same way as humans? Well, I'm kind of neutral on that. I'm interested in ways of achieving cooperation that fit human beings and also ones that maybe don't fit human beings, right? Coming back to this idea that, well, the self-driving cars really don't need to be designed the way that we are. Here is maybe the most traditional way of getting to cooperation in something like the prisoner's dilemma, is this idea that, well, really, in real life, usually we don't play a game just once and then disappear. We interact with people over and over again. And without going into the technical details, right? But the idea here is that, well, if I might defect on you today and I might get a little bit of advantage from that today, but then tomorrow you're going to punish me. Maybe forever onward, you're never going to want to interact with me again. Every day you're going to punish me. And overall, that is a much greater cost than the benefit that I get from deviating once, right? This is the idea behind folk theorems, that like we can really sustain something like cooperation over time strategically with this idea that if somebody deviates from it, we'll punish them. So is that enough? So earlier on, we talked about this idea of sharing information across a social network. And so let's go back to that. And this actually is earlier work with my then PhD student, Catherine Moon, where also we thought about the network aspect of this, right? So let's say I do something that's not so nice to Raphael. Well, then maybe for a while I don't really suffer the consequences. But meanwhile, Raphael tells Joe, and besides my me not knowing about it, Joe then tells Adam, and then I interact with Adam, and then I eventually feel the consequences, right? So that it's not just from the direct pairwise interaction, but you can even strengthen this effect through social networks. Now, this also allowed us to give an algorithm for finding the maximal set of agents that would be able to cooperate with each other in a particular graph. And that allowed us to do some interesting experiments. So I was kind of curious, like as you vary some aspects, like how patient agents are or how much they benefit from cooperation, what happens to the size of the set of agents that can cooperate? And it turns out it doesn't change gradually, it changes very rapidly. So you might be over here and things are going perfectly fine. So this is a setting where people are patient and they benefit a lot from cooperation. And you might be just over here and think everything is going fine. And it turns out I always want to say you fall off a cliff. I should have drawn it the other way. But you might be very close to a point where the parameters have changed just enough that cooperation falls apart. Okay. So many other things you could do here. I want to talk a little bit though about ways of getting to cooperation that don't fit human beings. Rafa, how much time do you have?
12, 30 minutes.
Okay, good. And if you, there's a puzzle outside. If you want to do the puzzle at some point, we have way too many copies of the puzzle. Thank you for printing them, but that's way too many. But so please take a copy of the puzzle, even if you're just going to scribble something else on it, just to not waste the paper. This first slide here, if you do want to do the puzzle, this slide is somewhat relevant to it, and also illustrates that, well, when we talk about AI systems, maybe there are other ways that we can get to cooperation that wouldn't work for human beings. Okay, and so the first thing I'll introduce here is actually upcoming IchGuy paper, which is about simulating other players, right? I can't really simulate another human being. I can try, I can have a model of them, but I can't completely accurately simulate them. But with an AI system, you could actually run it. You can audit it. You can try to see if it's what kind of behavior it would give. Okay, here's an example game. So before the simulation, so I'll add something to this game in a second, but for now it's just a simple game. This is known as the trust game in the literature. Experimentalists like this a lot. So in the experiment, what you do is you get two subjects in the room. You give the first one $10, and that one can give any of that to the other player. Any money that the first player gives to the second player gets tripled before the second player receives it. Okay, that's step one. And then step two is the second player can give back whatever they like. This time it doesn't get tripled. Okay. Sometimes it's called the investment game. Like I'm investing in my friend's great startup idea, and I just trust that he'll give me something back. Now the kind of so here's a simplified version of that. So here, instead of being able to give any amount, you can only choose to give 5 or 0, just to have it more manageable on the slide. And then player 2 can either choose to keep everything, all the full 15, for himself, or can give back 10. Those are the only options. Okay. And if you reason through it by backward induction, as it's known, right? We say, well, player 2 really has no incentive to give anything back. Right, at least thinking selfishly, it would take the full 15. Player 1 can perfectly well anticipate that, and so says, well, I don't want to end up with 0, so I'm just going to keep my 5, and we end up here. Okay, and this is undesirable because this outcome would have been better for everybody. Okay, now we're going to add to it this idea that we can simulate. So player 1 now has an additional action, which is I'm going to choose to simulate player 2, right? For human beings, that doesn't really make sense. I can kind of think about what the other player might do, but it won't necessarily be accurate. Whereas here, the idea is you actually would be accurate in finding out what the other player or the other AI system would in fact do. Okay, so if you're player 1 and you choose to simulate player 2, now simulated player 2 has to make a decision. Okay, this is simulated player 2's move to either give back or not give back. Okay. And now I'm going to assume that really this game should be larger. At that point, player 1 has to decide whether to give or not give in real life. I'm going to assume just that the outcome of the simulation immediately determines what player 1 will do. That player 1 will give back if player 2 gave something. Okay, so that's why there's not a player 1 node here, because the tree would get too big. So here, player 1 is not going to give any money because player 2 in simulation didn't give anything back. Whereas here, player 2 in simulation gave back, so player 1 gave in real life, and then player 2 again has to decide whether, not now in real life, whether to give or not. Okay. So how should you play this game? Well, it's obvious. If you're player 2, you should give when you're in simulation, and not give in the real world. Okay. Anybody remember Volkswagen's scandal a while ago? With the, right, so Volkswagen had actually, like, the cars were being tested for how much they would emit, but somebody clever at Volkswagen had figured out how to detect whether the car was currently being audited in terms of its emissions. So in those cases, it would keep down the emission, and out on the highway, actually, it just went full blast. So the idea is that you should not be able to do that. And so instead, all these nodes should.
Whether it's being simulated or not.
What's that?
They have to know the distinction.
So in order for this to have a chance of working, player 2 needs to not know whether player 2 is being simulated or not. And this is where it gets a little bit funny to think about. So you're player 2, right? But as an algorithm, you don't know whether you're being run in simulation or in real life. And that's what this information set indicates, that player 2 actually cannot distinguish between being here in simulation, or here. Now I have a chance to mention TARC. We got a paper rejected from TARC this year on not this paper, but a related paper. And it was a technical game theory paper. And I thought it was interesting that, and one of the reviewers commented, well, like, it's all fine and good. But, and this was the comment, like, but we don't live in the matrix and we are not brains and bats. And so I'm quite proud of having, I'm imagining this is a first. If anybody else ever got a technical game theory paper rejected for us not being brains and vats, please let me know. But the idea is, like, for AI systems, right? So maybe we should have been a little bit clearer in our paper, but for AI systems, that this makes sense. That's the idea. Okay.
Actually, Joe
yeah.
had a paper, I don't know if you about game theory with translucent players. With the first, okay.
I'm gonna mention
it. It was accepted in TARC.
It was accepted. Okay, you didn't get the okay.
I don't remember.
No, but yeah, but your paper is like about corporations and something leaks from a corporation, right? So, yeah. Good.
You don't actually know if it's a simulation.
Sorry, we don't know if it's a simulation.
You don't know if it's a simulation of you.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, like, and like, there's philosophy papers about this, right? Like, I don't know if I'm in a simulation right now at some level. But okay, good. Actually, David Chalmers, a famous philosopher of mind, has a whole book on how virtual worlds at some level would be just as real as our actual world. Anyway, that's a whole aside. Okay. And this leads to lots of interesting questions. Like, if you're player 2, right, should you, like, you wake up, should you now have some belief about, like, what is the probability that you're currently being simulated? Can you make sense of that?
Being simulated. What does it mean you're being simulated? Let me see something.
Yeah, that's the sort of great. It is confusing, right? But so here the idea is, like, I'm like, if you can imagine, like, you're an algorithm.
Yeah.
You're currently being run, and it's like, hey, like, Moshe, like, Vince gave you $5. It turned into $15. Are you going to give money back? But you realize this may be a simulation that you're in, right? So maybe Moshe was the reviewer. No.
No, but does the simulated player care to get money?
Good. So that is, yes. So the simulated player here, the assumption is that it cares about what happens in the outside world. Okay. So it actually wants the same thing that the real player 2 wants.
So what's the difference between an algorithm that's being simulated and an algorithm that's being run?
Correct. Correct. Except, so exactly. So there is no good distinction in terms of the actual process of it. It's a distinction in terms of the impact, right? So here the algorithm really gets to work with real money, and here not, right? I guess we can have discussions about, like, whether you're observing me handing you the money, and, like, but it might be a simulation of me, but, like, to you it's the same thing because it's just the same inputs. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. So now you get lots of these interesting questions that traditionally have been studied more in the philosophy literature and not in the, let's say, more applied or econ game theory literature. And those now become suddenly very relevant. You get all these questions that don't really normally apply to human beings. What should you do if you knew other people could read your code? Right? For human beings, doesn't really make, like, maybe somebody is scanning my brain. Maybe my sister can look at my face and kind of know what I'm thinking, probably a little bit more than I would like her to sometimes. But it's not really at the level of reading my code, right? Or what if you knew you were facing a copy of yourself? here are Mark and Scott Kelly, NASA astronauts. So they're identical twins, and they decided on the same career. But even they are not exactly the same, right? One of them grew a mustache. Okay. Or what if you knew you had been in the same situation before, but there's no way you could possibly remember what you did? This is actually relevant to the example from the slide before, right? That if you're now the real player too, you can't really remember what you did in simulation, right? We're not going to allow that. Or we could, if we allowed that, then it would make it too easy. Okay. And this led to a nice idea. Program equilibrium, Moshe Tenenholtz, who's here. And there's some other history to this idea as well. But this is a way to get the cooperation in the prisoner's dilemma in one shot. So this is not a repeated prisoner's dilemma. It's a one-shot game. But now instead of the players choosing just to cooperate or defect, instead they write programs, right? So we have a game between two programmers that write programs, and the use of the program is that the programs can actually read the other program. And now this turns out to be an equilibrium, which is this use this program, which says check if the other code is the other player's code is the same as mine. If so, cooperate. Otherwise, defect. If they both play this, it's an equilibrium, right? Because you don't want to change. They're actually going to end up cooperating. And if you changed anything at all about your program, you would end up defecting. Sorry, the other player would end up defecting, right? You may end up defecting or cooperating, but in any case, it's going to be worse for you. And so here too, I won't even get to all of the cases where Joe's work has come up, but here's one which is what Raphael just mentioned. This paper on game theory with translucent players, and not exactly the same, but closely related direction. Okay, I'll skip over a few things here. So that's in a model where really we have two programmers that choose programs. But now I want to kind of think from the inside, right? That's instead of thinking about the programmer making a decision, now imagine in some sense you are the AI system, you are the algorithm, and imagine you're facing a copy of yourself. Should you then cooperate or not? Or a little bit more human way of saying it is the following. Suppose you had an identical twin, you grew up together, and like your whole life, every time somebody asked you to make a decision, you always made the exact same decision. Somebody asked you what flavor ice cream you wanted, you said strawberry. The next day, they asked you again, you both said chocolate. Okay, so now I'm going to do this by show of hands. So imagine you had a twin like that, and then one day you play prisoner's dilemma against your twin. Now I ask you to imagine you're still selfish, right? And also like you're never going to encounter your twin again. Somehow, it's like kind of a sad story. But you know, imagine, right? So you shouldn't cooperate out of niceness, but you could make the argument here that look, if you cooperate, probably the twin is going to cooperate as well. Okay. So how many people in like under those conditions would you cooperate by show of hands? Who would cooperate? Okay. Who would defect? Okay, some mixture. Okay, good. Once upon a time, I think I did it. What's that? We have actual twins here, yes. Maybe not quite as identical. What's that?
David's defecting against me, so I'm going to cooperate.
Good. Now, some game theorists get really upset about the idea of cooperating here. In fact, I did this once in a rump session of a TARC, and some of the game theorists got really upset at some of the people that raised their hands for cooperate here, because in some sense this does kind of fly in the face of traditional game theoretic reasoning.
The reason is whatever I'm thinking, my identical twin is also thinking, right?
That would be the idea, yeah.
That's the concept of identical twin. So it's not a separate entity, right?
Okay, good. Okay, so let's. How about this? Okay, how about this then? Okay, now suppose you like same story as before, but there was one time when you were 8 years old, somebody asked you, "What flavor ice cream do you want?" One of you said chocolate, the other one said strawberry. Everybody was in shock. You all remember this happened, but it never happened again. Like rest of your lives, always the same decision again. Okay, all right, slight modification. Who cooperates now? Okay, including you, right? So it doesn't seem, well, so that's a question like, you know, how How far does this go? Of course, the idea here is really more like we're more interested in computer programs or something, right? But even there, you might have overlap, right? Like we have the same decision theory module, but otherwise we're different. Maybe we learned a few different things. How do you make sense of this? And we have an upcoming TARC paper on that as well. All right, lots of other things we could talk about, but I think I'm out of time. Right, Rafa? Okay. All right, well, thank you very much and happy birthday, Joe.